of all, the best bargain in town, other than being a member of the museum, is being a member of the Pearson.
In great depth. This is something that I became really obsessed with during my time as a PhD student at Iowa State studying rural and environmental history, and especially the piece of this that relates to the before and the after. And as we look at this, we're going to talk a lot about Inkpaduta tonight. But first I want you to think about your own connection to this story. Maybe you're somebody that spends a lot of your time working on a board with this. Maybe you've given more tours about this than I could ever hope to imagine in my whole life. Or maybe you're somebody that teaches social studies here in the area and you're looking to learn more about this. And one of the things is, I guarantee you I'm not the smartest person in the room when it comes to some of this stuff. One of the reasons I love talking in Spirit Lake is I always learn something new. Even this afternoon in Lake Park, I came away with a couple of things to think about and chase down further. I look forward to those conversations kind of as we get to the end. But I want to start with you and your ties to this story. And when we think about this, I think it starts with the lakes. The Iowa Great Lakes. When people talk about the lakes where I live in Mason City, or I teach at Waldorf University in Forest City, when people are talking about going to the lakes, they mean that they're coming here. And it's a really special place to people. People have a lot of different memories. People have ancestral ties that go all the way back to the very beginning of American settlement here. I've been fortunate enough to meet people with ties that go back beyond that in some of our indigenous peoples as I've investigated this over the years. And I want you to think about your own connection to this story. What Spirit Lake, or the Iowa Great Lakes broadly, mean to you as a place of significance. And we're going to talk about what people commonly call the Spirit Lake Massacre, and we'll get there, but we're going to really be focused on the Dakota this evening, what people commonly call the Sioux. And we can see we got to clean these up a little bit, but that's why Friends Group is doing an incredible job. As we look at this, we can move forward, and I want to start in Iowa, before Iowa. And this is an interesting kind of thing to think about, but I think we have to take a step back here to think about the Dakota and our other indigenous peoples living in this place. And Iowa's not the easiest place to live as we move through the calendar year. If you think about, we have terrible winters. I know it's like finally warm outside after this just awful thing. I'm sure that you were inside reading about this all winter, because who wants to go outside when it's 40 degrees below zero and the wind's whipping off the lake? Or we think about where we're headed into June and July, where it gets incredibly hot and humid, and we have huge thunderstorms and tornadoes that roll through. And one of the things that got me started on this journey was wanting to better understand the people that came before me here. I'm going to talk tonight about how I truly believe that the better we understand the past, the better we can understand who we are, and how that can help us become who we hope to be in the future. And when I think about this story, and I think about what Iowa looked like before, I think back to two memories. The first being, I was a really small child living in Mason City. I was fortunate, I was walking along the Winnebago River with my grandfather in East Park in Mason City. And I had been born in Forest City, I eventually grew up in Pella, but in that brief moment in time, this conversation sticks in my mind, where I remember walking and asking my grandfather, well, why is it called the Winnebago River? Being born in Forest City, even as a young kid, I knew it's weird that you would name a river after a recreational vehicle. My grandpa was very patient, and I was always the person that asked too many questions and talked too much, and that hasn't changed at all. But he told me, oh no, it's a native people, and the thing that stuck in my mind was, he said, but they never really probably lived here. And so we fast forward to I'm sitting in my office at Waldorf University in Salveson Hall, and I'm looking out of my window and I'm trying to think about what I want to work on. And I'm looking out at the Winnebago County Courthouse, and that memory flashed in my mind. And I started to think about, well, I'm here in Winnebago County, and the more I dug into it, the more I became convinced the Winnebago, or the Ho-Chunk ancestral people of Wisconsin, really never made it to Winnebago County. And I wanted to dive deeper into the past and start to better understand this story, and it's really complex. So tonight, as we go through this, I'm going to talk about this kind of in 4 stages. We're going to use Inkpaduta's life to work our way up to March of 1857. And if you've never heard this story, I can't imagine it came out. That'd be crazy. But I'll try to give you some of the details, but I'm not going to get incredibly bogged down in some of the things. When we look at Iowa before Iowa, this is the moment where Inkpaduta is born on these wide open prairies of Iowa and southern Minnesota. Born to the Wapakute Dakota chief, Tisagi. And he's born at the beginning of the 1800s as Iowa's about to change in unbelievable ways. Our state's changed more than perhaps any other place on earth since the early 1800s. 98% of our land surface transitioned as we moved through American settlement and into agriculture. And I think if we can take a step back and try to understand through Inkpaduta's eyes what that change looked like, it brings a new complexity to this story. Now, a few things we got to get out of the way. First, we're in Spirit Lake, so I know somebody in the room's grandmother told them when the northwest wind blew that it was Inkpaduta's ghost coming to get them, or that if you were a bad kid, Inkpaduta would come in the night. And we got to set some of that stuff aside. And I want you to just, what I talk about with my students all the time is empathy is really important, trying to understand, like the author Harper Lee in her famous novel that many of you read talked about, you just have to get inside somebody's skin and walk around for a little while. And I've tried to do this on all sides of this story, and some of the characters we're going to talk about tonight, like, I'll never be able to understand what Abby Gardner lived through. And if you're familiar with this story, as a child, 14 years old, about the age my niece is now, the horrors that she experienced and lived through defy the imagination. Inkpaduta also is going to live through a story of incredible destructive change around him. And I think that brings some complexity. We're going to talk about Roland Gardner a little bit. Some of you might know about the book already, so you'll see it there on page 17 or wherever it is in that particular copy, where Abby describes her dad in the most glowing terms of, he was a wide awake man, always chasing this horizon. And all of these people were acting in their best interest. They were all seeing the world and trying to make decisions that would allow them to live. And so as we look at this, I'm going to talk about 4 frontiers tonight that move across Iowa during this time period. And we're going to start by talking a little bit for a second about sovereignty and autonomy. Sovereignty and autonomy, when I'm talking about it tonight, we're going to talk about this as control over land and natural resources. A people's ability to make choices about how those are utilized and how they're able to move through their environment. All of human civilization is predicated upon 4 inches of topsoil and us being able to feed ourselves. And I'm not like the most hungry person, but I can tell you that like I've been married long enough to know that if I'm with my wife somewhere and I have not fed her, I'm in trouble. And that's maybe an oversimplification of where I'm going. But the Dakota had spent a long time before Inkpaduta's even born learning how to live in this difficult environment. You think about the challenges of living in Iowa before our modern era. And the Dakota had spent hundreds, if not thousands of years adapting lifeway practices to living here. And they hunted buffalo, they moved throughout the year, they definitely had established villages. I always think about, like, if you've ever been down to Fort Dodge, or if you haven't, you need to go tomorrow. Go down and go to the Guido Van Hilton grain silo mural, and think about how that's on top of Inkpaduta's village at Lizard Creek in the Des Moines River. Think about how there was 5,000 observed people in that village at a time period where that puts it on par with many eastern cities in the United States. And that's during the summer. The Dakota, because this is a difficult place to live, would have a flexible structure, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. When we think about Iowa before Iowa, we think about sovereignty and autonomy, I can promise you that the Dakota viewed themselves as a sovereign people. Maybe I got to back up a second and talk about kind of the Dakota themselves. So we talk about the Sioux a lot, right? That's an Anishinaabe word. It's an Algonquin derivative. One of the things that's happening is people are coming from Europe to explore this part of the world. They're largely moving west. We have some people coming south from Hudson's Bay. But one of the important questions they're going to ask any people they come into contact with are, who are we going to meet next? Or maybe even, who do we have to be afraid of? And what we commonly call the Sioux, or they call themselves the Ocheti Sakowin, or the Seven Council Fires, created an empire as they gained access to guns coming down from Hudson's Bay and English traders. And they were spread over this incredible expanse of land that's all the way out to Wyoming and Montana and stretching all the way into Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin. And they subdivide into other parts. So I think we got to get some terminology out of the way. So when we talk about the Sioux, sometimes I think it's really important that we draw equivalencies, or at least try to understand this. And this isn't perfect, so halo of mercy or something. But when we talk about this, usually when I talk about the Ocheti Sakowin or the Sioux broadly, I think about that as a people that viewed themselves as a sovereign government. So here we are, we're in the United States. I can tell you, I drove down Highway 9 today, I saw all the flags. I think about the Dakota would have viewed themselves as equally valid, equally sovereign, and equally free to make their own choices by the time Americans arrive here. And so our first frontier is going to be an indigenous frontier. Because sometimes we kind of take for granted that these peoples interacted with each other in different ways, that as sovereign states that were pushing against each other and changing boundaries, and we have all these different things going on. And when we think about the Sioux, we can go with that kind of like, I think about that as almost a national level, and then we go to the next level. So if we think about this on this, and I'm colorblind, so bear with me, but we have the Dakota out west, which are going to be some of the people you're really familiar with from like American history in the 1870s. If you think about huge figures like the Dakota leaders Sitting Bull, or Crazy Horse, or some of these other leaders that we see later on, they're more part of that part of this broader overarching society. We have the Yanktonai in the middle, and then here in our neighborhood, we have the Dakota. And so I think about that as kind of being like a state level almost. At least, and we're not drawing a perfect equivalency here, but it's a way to think about it. Then if we break that in half, we can break it into the Santee is going to be our even more local unit. We know because we're here, because of the good folks of the Dickinson County Museum, friends of Abby Gardner Sharp, we're here in Dickinson County at the Iowa Great Lakes. That's how I think of maybe that Santee level. And then they break it into one further piece. I'm not sure exactly where we are. I think we're in Inkapaduta, but I get lost out here still. But at that local level, we see these small groups that we can think of as more like town type of units. We talk about this a lot. If you've read into this at all, you've come across the Red Top Band or Inkpaduta's band. And the Dakota would call it a Tayo Yaspe, but I'm not trying to tie everybody up with these words, so we'll talk about it as a band this evening. And they lived in this area. If you go to John's talk, John Dorshuk, you can ask him all sorts of questions about his Abby Gardner Sharp dig or the summer before. He was out at Minnewacan State Park, and he's been uncovering all sorts of really meaningful archaeological evidence that tie the Dakota at Spirit Lake to Inkpaduta, which is the center of their universe, which you've probably been there. If you've ever been to Fort Snelling or the Twin Cities Airport, you're right on top of the heart of Dakota culture in this moment before Americans arrive. And as we see these indigenous frontiers shifting, changes are coming even before Europeans arrive in this part of the world. Because there's vast trade networks, these peoples had economies, they had social systems, they had cultures, and the historian Richard White will mention again later in his 1991 book, he wrote brilliantly, it's called The Middle Ground, and he was talking about how people in the broader Great Lakes region of the upper Midwest were caught between the Iroquoian hammer of peoples that were gaining access to guns on the eastern coast of the United States and the Siouan anvil, where people were gaining access to guns from Hudson's Bay to the north from European traders. And so those technologies show up here on the plains and prairies of Iowa long before Europeans themselves start to arrive. And we have these different peoples competing sovereignly and autonomously, whether we want to talk about the Iowa or Mahoe, whether we want to talk about peoples like the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin, whether we want to talk about the Sauk and Meskwaki that still are a vibrant part of our community in Iowa today. These borders are being defined and redefined constantly, and I think about it as kind of a frontier during this time period. Also during this time period, we're not going to see a lot of resistance. One of the things I'm going to talk about is Americanization and these different resistance strategies that we see playing out. As we move closer and closer to Inkpaduta and Spirit Lake in March of 1857, his responses change as a leader of his people. Where's your breaking point? What would it take before you would stand up and resist changes to your traditions, to your life ways, how you feed your family? I want you to keep that in the back of your mind and think how we get pushed these different resistance points as we move through time. And if we're going to try to understand Inkpaduta, we have to understand this resistance. So I'll call this cultural neutral, and we can move on. And we can start to talk about these initial inroads that show up with the French first in this area. So the French are going to primarily base, once they arrive in the upper Midwest, out of Prairie du Chien, at least in our Iowa story. I know, because if you go there, next time you're in Prairie du Chien, which is another summer spot people go to, you can go to the Crawford County Historical Society, you can go to the very back, and you can look at my wife's family tree. It goes back to the 1300s in France, and she's the little tiniest leaf at the very end, but it traces back to the early history of Prairie du Chien. And the French come, and they're going to start creating maps, which is something that's really useful to me as a historian. I try to think about, what do we know about this? We have Abby's account, which relays her experience decades after it happened. And she lived through these incredibly traumatic events. The Dakota also have their stories about this. One of the things that I really value about their culture, but find frustrating sometimes, is they don't have to tell me what they think about stuff. They have their own knowledge protection. They have their own knowledge transmission systems. They have an oral history. They have objects that hand down their stories. And they know a lot. We know from various indigenous leaders, like Nohart drew a map of Iowa and the upper Midwest that had every single major watershed detailed correctly in 1838, because he was getting ready to go to Washington, D.C. and say, see, here's where we live. And I can tell you, and we'll show you as we go through, our American maps weren't that good in 1838. So as I try to put these sources together and try to understand how the Dakota are living, and part of it is that I've gained lots of knowledge from different people that have been willing to talk to me, or some of the things that are written. There's a wonderful book called Minnesota Makoke that's by Gwen Westerman, who's an enrolled tribal member, and she talks really early in the book about the significance of Spirit Lake and how the Dakota lived here, and if we just listen, we'll understand their story better. We can also see this on the earliest available maps. Anybody live on a century farm? So you've been here for a while. I think about this a lot in that we really value that. I love the Heritage Farm and the Century Farm program, people with deep ties to land, and I think that that's something that gets into your blood and puts down your roots. And sometimes when I think about it, I think about the Dakota in a similar way. We know, whether it's from John Dorshak's archaeological evidence, whether it's from listening to the Dakota people themselves, whether it's from looking at maps from the French, we know the Dakota are living in this area the moment Europeans arrive. And we can see this is a map courtesy of our friends at the State Historical Society. This is a map, French map from one of the earliest explorations. And you can see that we have Iowa outlined here. This would be the Des Moines confluence. So we can put Humboldt there. This would be the city of Des Moines there. And we can think about that, like Sioux is in giant letters here above this boundary that the French are drawing on this map. So their earliest explorations are placing the Dakota here, which they would tell us. And we know from some of these other sources. We can look at a couple of other French maps as knowledge develops about this. So we have two other French maps from this early era. We have the Chemin des Voyageurs on this map that's going through. That's a road that went from Prairie du Chien to Spirit Lake that the French used. They talk about it in their records as being an indigenous road that they started to co-op so they could build trade during the fur trade era. Which is going to be really important to what the French wanted to get out of their experience in this part of the world. And we can see here, this is the Little Sioux on this map. These are supposed to be Spirit Lake. And if we start to look through it, we can see that we have Sioux labeled here in this area, kind of in the north central Iowa area, stretching over here. And it starts with the Sioux and stretches across the lakes. We can also see this where it says Sioux of the East. We do have, as we look at, we have Iowas on here, which would be the Iowa, who are another Siouan-speaking people, not a part of what we think about as this broader Siouan Confederacy. But the broader point I want you to get is, from this sovereignty and autonomy perspective, we can start to see that the earliest sources are putting the Dakota here, and the French interact with them in a little bit different way than the Americans or even the British before the United States takes control. And there's somebody way smarter than me, her name's Kathleen Duval. She teaches, I believe, at Duke. And she wrote a book that talks about this step of incorporation. This is how the French largely approached their relationships with native peoples across the upper Midwest. You guys know about Lewis and Clark? You like heard of those guys? My first job after college, I worked at the Fort Abraham Lincoln Foundation up in Bismarck, Mandan, North Dakota, and worked in Honest Land, which was always a really interesting experience, as I would often find myself, especially this time of year, being the white guy giving tours to like the schools from the reservations, which really encouraged me to know what I was talking about, be thorough in my research. But when we think about incorporation, Lewis and Clark, I think, helps. We can think about Meriwether Lewis, we can talk about William Clark, but we also know other famous names from that story, like people in North Dakota call her Sakakawea. Most of you would think of her as Sacagawea, who's a Shoshone woman who's captured by the Hidatsa in a revenge raid out on the plains of Montana, and then comes and is incorporated into their tribe, and eventually married to the French trader Charbonneau, who comes along to translate on the journey. And this is maybe representative of how the French approached a lot of their relationships with native peoples. They sought to incorporate themselves as outsiders into this culture. Charbonneau moved into the Mandan Hidatsa village, married somebody within their tribal group, learned their language, and then reaped the economic benefit of being able to trade with them to gain access to the fur trade. We see that also in Iowa, whether it's the fur trading posts that are going to be established down on the Des Moines River in the southeastern part of the state, or even we know there was a French trading post that was built on what's now Frank Gotch State Park near Humboldt that was located during this time period in order to gain access to the fur trade, because this is a pretty good place to trap furs. Also a pretty good place to shoot birds, still is. But you guys ever think about how Duke Gilbert just shot 5,000 birds over like a month one time and stretched between the East and West O, and how he had to be the greatest trap shooter of all time? Man, I get caught up thinking about that guy all the time. We also had otter and beaver and muskrats, and these furs that are going to be very valuable to the French on these European markets, and that's why they're here. They're here to gain this economic benefit, and they're willing to incorporate themselves into the tribe. We also have new frontiers developing as first the British come into the space and then eventually the Americans. And the first frontier we really have to look at changing life during kind of Inkpaduta's time is going to be these governmental frontiers. First, we need treaties. William Clark pops into our story again here. William Clark's going to oversee the first major treaty that's going to take place in 1825 at Prairie du Chien. And the Multinational Treaty of Prairie du Chien, in William Clark's journal, he describes it, if you read it, you get a sense that he thought of it as this great dividing. They wanted to put borders between these native peoples that have been ranging through environments to survive and had kind of built their own sovereign and autonomous boundaries. He talked about it as hemming in a lot of the time. And we can see the treaties moving. These are largely Sauk and Meskwaki treaties following the Black Hawk War in 1832. Then they're going to establish the secondary line at Red Rock, and then by 1842 we're going to try to move the Sauk and Meskwaki completely out of the state. And in 1857, the Meskwaki buy the settlement and move back to Iowa. The Dakota are going to, we have the 1825 treaty is going to draw boundaries, and those boundaries are going to be redrawn in 1830. This is going to be really important for us to consider in a minute, so keep that in the back of your mind. Treaties are just pieces of paper, though. Can you imagine what it would have been like to go to Prairie du Chien and have all of these different peoples that speak different languages coming together with their own maps to try to go like, you live here and I live here and this is a boundary you can't cross? Oh, and by the way, we can't enforce it. And I don't know if any of you were like me, but I drove here today from Mason City and like, I don't follow the speed limits unless there's cops there. So to support this, one of the other things that's going to happen by 1830 is what's called the Indian Removal Act. You probably remember this from high school social studies. You're talking about in 1830, the Andrew Jackson administration passes the only significant piece of legislation that's going to pass during his first term. And we oftentimes think about this in the context of the Trail of Tears and what people call the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek. But there were other provisions of that, and the one that's really important to us is the treaty, or the Indian Removal Act of 1830 also stipulates a moving frontier line of military forts meant to continue moving indigenous peoples west. And we can see this legacy on the map of Iowa very clearly. So if we go and we look at this first early era of forts, we're going to see Fort Snelling, Camp Coldwater in the Twin Cities. We're going to see Prairie du Chien and Fort Crawford. We're going to see Fort Madison. And then eventually we're going to see first Fort Des Moines at Montrose down by Keokuk in the extreme southeastern part of Iowa. And as things advance over the 1830s, things change. By 1834, we move to this intermediate level of forts where the frontiers jumped forward and America's projecting military power from places like Fort Atkinson on the Turkey River and from Second Fort Des Moines at the confluence of the Des Moines and Raccoon Rivers, which I think about as the parking lot to Principal Park. If you ever go see the Iowa Cubs, you can go see the cabin. There's a beautiful mural by Hildy de Brunier depicting the dragoons and indigenous life in the parking lot. You'll miss it if you don't look, though. It's kind of tucked away. But we have these kind of American frontiers pushing into this, and we can see the resistance strategies are going to change. So this is a painting of the multinational treaty at Prairie du Chien, but we see passive resistance to these first treaties. I teach college. I think I could have taught middle school. That's probably what I would have done if I didn't do this. One of my former students is here, so like, I know in your classroom, if you have a lot of rules and people don't want to follow them, their first step is to just passively resist. This is how all sorts of people do all sorts of things. We ignore things that we don't take seriously. And the Dakota are going to test out this American treaty immediately. So in 1825, the Dakota, the Wapakute Dakota specifically, that are going to occupy this part of the state that we're in tonight, go into Prairie du Chien in 1825 and they make an agreement. If we go back to our map, they're going to agree, they get this 1846 piece and this 1851 piece and some of these other pieces out here that are going to be redefined by further agreements. The Sauk and Meskwaki are going to be granted this southern portion of the state based off the confluence, which William Williams, who's the sutler at Fort Dodge, founder of the city of Fort Dodge, he called it the River of the Sioux, above the confluence forks of the Des Moines River in Humboldt. And almost immediately there are problems. Tisagi, Inkpaduta's father, is going to see his wife killed in a Sauk raid. Now, according to the stories, and this, I don't know, we could be playing historical telephone, the Sauk invaded their village while the men were out hunting. They killed one of Tisagi's wife. They chopped off her head and threw her body in the river, which is pretty brutal. And some of the stuff we're talking about isn't the most pleasant. And Tisagi actually tried to go work within the American system. In 1826, he shows up, and Lawrence Telefier, who's the Indian agent at Fort Snelling, he shows up, and he basically asks him what he's going to do about it. And we can look at Telefier's journal, and we can see him saying, there's really not anything I can do about that. What he says is that he can barely project power beyond the walls of Fort Snelling, let alone way out there on the frontier. And this is where we come back to our empathy piece and think about, like, well, I'm not going to think about my wife getting her head chopped off and thrown in a river. But if we put ourselves in these people's shoes, we can see what Tisagi does, and we can see the Dakota, the Wapakute Dakota, passively resisting American dominance and Americanization coming, because what they do is they just don't sign another treaty. They don't go back to Prairie du Chien in 1830, the Wapakute Dakota that live here. They don't sign that treaty. They don't sign the treaties at Mendota Heights in 1851. They never agree to give away the lands where we're standing now, where Roland Gardner is going to move his family. There are other people that sign for those tribes. Other parts of this broader Sioux nation that makes up all of these different localities. And one of the things that we're going to see is a complete rejection of American authority by leaders like Tisagi and Wamdesapa and Sido-Meneduta, and then eventually Inkpaduta as we move through the 1800s. And this is where passive resistance comes in, because they just continue to live their lives how they would. Now they're getting together in big gatherings during the summer when things are thick. You might go on a bison hunt out to the Dakotas with a lot of other bands. You might then come together for events of cultural significance in the same way we do. I grew up in Pella. I went back for Tulip Festival last weekend. It was nice. I ate some poffergies. I toured the windmill. It was awesome. Made Maybe you're going to go to Orange City in a couple weeks and do the same things, right? We do these same things, and sometimes we rob indigenous cultures of having their same kind of gravity and the pull of these things. But when things get tough in the winter, one of the things we see the Dakota doing is splitting into smaller groups and moving into different watersheds. A lot of times we picture indigenous peoples as just a static part of the past, especially the Sioux. We picture them on horseback, chasing buffalo herds, and in Iowa I don't know that that's the reality. We did have buffalo populations here. The last buffalo ever sighted in the state of Iowa was at the head of the Little Sioux River in 1870. I'm sure some of you already knew that. But the Dakota were much more reliant on things like elk and deer, and one of the things that we see is them splitting into these small groups, these taoyaspes or bands, like the Red Top Band, where Inkpaduta during the winter is going down to Smithland and hunting along the Little Sioux River and into Nebraska, and they're living by trapping these backwater creeks and being able to feed themselves, spreading out from the rest of the population in a way that really makes sense. We see them just continuing to assert authority. I went looking for Inkpaduta. That's actually how I first arrived at the Dickinson County Museum. I was just driving around northwestern Iowa for like 3 years, trying to see where Inkpaduta showed up in records. And I found it, like 29 different counties. I found him ranging through and living life largely as the Dakota lived it prior to Americans arrived, and him largely ignoring American authority or working with it when it was to his advantage in the same way I think anybody would. So as we move through this passive resistance phase, we move into this era of pioneer settlement. Anybody seen this painting before? Yeah, I was going to say, everybody that's ever made a law in Iowa, or if you've ever been to the state capitol, you've seen it. You can't miss it. It's 32 feet wide and 12 feet tall, and it's on the grandest staircase in the state. It's painted by a guy named Edwin Blashfield, who also painted probably the most famous painting at the Chicago World's Fair in the 1890s. He was commissioned to depict this pioneer sentiment of Iowa after the frontier era had passed through. It's truly a breathtaking painting to see in person. My wife is very annoyed that I stop there every time to go look at it. But if we look at this painting, and I should have used a different picture because we can't even see this far aside, this is representative of what we might call the pioneer spirit. This is what I'm talking about with Abby. Roland Gardner, I don't fault that guy at all for making a big bet. You think about he's born in an agricultural family where he doesn't inherit the farm in New York, ends up in Buffalo working in a comb factory, meets a girl, has a couple of kids, decides that his wages aren't cutting it and he needs to go out and do something different. And he takes up what Horace Greeley called the call of the age. Go west, young man, and grow up with the country. And I love Abby's descriptions of him in the book. You can tell she just really, really admired her father and thought of him as this wide-awake man who's representative of this call. And I truly believe Roland Gardner was doing everything he could to try to create a better life for his family. That's really relatable, right? We all hopefully do that. I hope you're not trying to tank things for the group. But this pioneer spirit, we can see this depicted in the Blashfield painting. On this end, we see these triumphant pioneers led by angels with very specific symbols. We're not going to get it if you want to read about it. I wrote about it in my dissertation for like 12 pages. You can learn everything you ever want to know about this painting. They're kind of coming into this, if we could see it, there's a bison skull, you can see the horn right there, and this just kind of like scrub land. And this is the image we're creating of these people coming, led by manifest destiny, by this call west, coming and bringing what we're going to talk about as civilization. While they do this, they're displacing peoples that had lived here for a long time. People that had built lifeways over thousands of years, that are trying to protect and build cultures. And we can see this, and behind them we got the corn coming, right? We know we're going to plant 96 million acres someday. I don't think they thought about it that way. But we see these pioneers coming, and this makes a change to sovereignty and autonomy because people change things. You think about the numbers of people that move into an area are going to radically redefine how everything in that environment works. That's one of the things I want you to keep in mind. This is an Iowa map. This is probably my favorite Iowa map. There's a 6 by 8 foot version of it in my living room that I just sit and I've been staring at it for like 10 years. And I don't know. This is Iowa in 1845. It's depicted by Barrows. You can get this from the Library of Congress. And one of the things that's super interesting to me is all these snobs, sorry if you're from Minnesota, all these people from Minnesota that look down on Iowans and they're like, oh, They're all from, like, if you're from southeastern Minnesota, you're just from Iowa. We just changed the border. This is what came out of the Constitutional Convention when Iowa went to submit for statehood in the 1840s. Now, they redefined the border, and a lot of that ties into other things we don't have time to get into tonight. One of the things they were trying to do in Congress is maintain a balance between states with slavery and free states, and they figured if they lopped off part of Minnesota, it allowed them to create more states, they could keep this balance. It's also why Florida and Iowa both came into the Union in the same year, because that would get 2 new senators from each. And they could vote with their interests. I talked about the no heart map, and I should put it in this presentation so we could see like these indigenous depictions of Iowa that are just shockingly crazy when you stack them up. But this is a map based off intelligence. We have a lot of different surveys that have gone on during this time period. By 1845, if you've ever been down to the Dragoon Trail, or you know about the mounted soldiers that went out of First Fort Des Moines, came up through this area and charted the Des Moines River. We've seen the Fremont expedition in 1841. We've seen Nathan Boone, whose dad was pretty famous, but Nathan was pretty cool too, and namesake of a town down in a county also named for him. He had done this survey of the neutral ground. But one of the things that stands out to me is like, even just driving around, or like I fly a lot of drone, or I have a giant map of Big Spirit above my desk. It doesn't look like that. They do have the Little Sioux kind of right in parts, and we know the Des Moines up to here is pretty well charted. The knowledge, as we get into this adaptive phase, is imperfect on the American side, but it's rapidly changing. And as adaptation comes into the picture, we all know what it is to adapt. I always think about this in the context of sports. Maybe if you ever played sports, or if you were in the fine arts, you experienced this also, I would think, where you have a really particularly demanding coach, instructor, that's going to bend you to their will, but you're willing to kind of fight back a little bit. You're not going to completely change me. And we see people adapting in a variety of different ways during this time period, which adaptation is just acting in your own interest. The Dakota are still trying to maintain sovereignty and autonomy. The best example of this is in 1832 at Bad Axe Creek, near Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. So real quickly, in 1832, the Sauk leader, Black Hawk, crosses the Mississippi River in defiance of the American government, with about 1,500 men, women, and children. They're returning to their ancestral home, the graves of their ancestors, at this place called Saukenuk, which was their principal village. They had well-established and fenced cornfields there. They'd had some other issues in the past, but they had been dispossessed by a treaty that they were very dubious of that took place in St. Louis in 1804. But what's important to our story is Black Hawk spent the following months fighting against the American government in one way or another. We had a military garrison at Prairie du Chien that's sent out. We have the Illinois State Militia called out, which has a very famous face in it, a guy named Abraham Lincoln that you probably heard of. He went on to be pretty famous. We have the Wisconsin Territorial Militia called out, and they're chasing and engaging with the Sauk people as they move through northern Illinois and Wisconsin. And we know about this because Black Hawk eventually told his story to a person that was mixed indigenous and French heritage, a guy named Antoine Leclerc, who's got a town named after him in Iowa. We know Black Hawk eventually, after the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, after things started to really struggle, became very worried about their ability to survive, and they start fleeing back towards the Mississippi River, hoping to meet with the Ho-Chunk Winnebago and an important one of their leaders at the Bad Axe Creek, where it empties into the Mississippi. But here's where we can see adaptation. So the Sauk and the Dakota are traditional enemies. The Dakota, think about the old adage, you know, enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the Dakota ally with the Americans, thinking that they're equal partners in this. And I do think they operated like that. The Americans didn't have the firepower to, what we're going to see in a lot of the letters that are written about this by the commanders, to punish the Sauk for crossing the river. So as the state militias are closing in from behind Black Hawk as they approach the Mississippi River, as the garrison from Fort Crawford is going up the river on the steamboat Warrior to meet the people as they try to cross, the Dakota have allied with the United States on the Iowa side. And an incredible moment of violence followed as men, women, and children tried to flee across the Mississippi. And the Dakota were a part of that, and you can see them acting as an adaptive people. It's in their interest to be a strong ally to the United States because it will put them in a better position as they continue forward in this changing dynamic. So we can see this taking place. The frontier we want to look at here is the most popular population frontier. This is how the government talked about it. The United States Census Bureau considered anything over 2 people per square mile to be behind the frontier. This is led by academic great-great-great-great-granddaddy, Frederick Jackson Turner, to show up at the Chicago World's Fair and declare the frontier closed. That's a stupid academic joke. I don't know. I studied with Pamela Riney-Kerberg at Iowa State, who studied with Al Bogue, who studied with Philip Merck, who studied with Ray Allen Billington, who studied with Frederick Jackson Turner, who's probably the most important American historian of the 1800s, especially when it comes to the frontier. And he talked about there was nothing, he wrote this essay and he presented it. I can't imagine like if you go to the Buffalo Bill Wild West show or ride the world's first Ferris wheel or even just try Cracker Jacks for the first time, like why you'd be going to listen to a history lecture, but I don't know what you guys are into, you're all here. They went to hear Frederick Jackson Turner talk about how there's nothing more formative in the American identity than the frontier. This rugged individualism, a lot of these things we still talk about as being a part of our identity, he's going to talk about, and he's declaring the frontier closed, saying America's going to move into a new era. We can see this playing out. This is one of the things why I only have some of the counties, why these are weird maps, but you should be able to figure it out because Kossuth is on there, and most of you live here, so you know Kossuth is tall because they couldn't drain Bancroft County. People still farm it now though, because time limit. But one of the things I set out to look for was how is this pressure, how is this population frontier acting upon the Dakota? Because the more people that show up, the more it's going to change outcomes. And we can see this playing out in my neighborhood. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But as this population frontier moves, we can see that we had a lot of census during the 1800s. We're doing state census very frequently. We have national census every 10 years. So even if we look at like 1856, the year before Inkpaduta shows up in Spirit Lake in March, we can see that this population frontier per square mile, there's only 2 counties, 3 if you count Hamilton, but that's a whole nother story for another time, have filled beyond this 2 people per square mile mark to move beyond the frontier. But it's creeping. By 1860, we can see this is filled in. Now, you know, because you live here, people were hesitant to move here, otherwise Jackson, Minnesota would have a different name. Turns out, really slowed things down there for a few years. But we can see like Cerro Gordo County where I live, or even Winnebago County is rising rapidly from having no registered official American citizen population to 0.7 people per square mile. It's creeping, and as these people come, they're moving this population frontier, which changes life for the Dakota. We'll talk about that in a minute. We can see the actual population numbers a little more clearly here, 1852, 1856, 1860, and we can just see that slowly people are moving into this area, whether it's from Europe, whether it's from the eastern United States, people like Roland Gardner coming for a variety of different reasons to create a new life. People like Ambrose Call. Him and his brother Asa showed up in Algona, and they were going to be the first settlers there, and then eventually his daughter married somebody who would like own the Star Tribune and Des Moines Register. They were both different things at that time period. But anyway, we know a lot about Ambrose Call because he wrote a lot of records, and he also met Inkpaduta at least twice. Showed up at his cabin, Inkpaduta came, and this is where our resistance piece comes in. Because as this population climbs, I think it's important that we get an understanding of like, these numbers are nuts. Like, think about official population of the state of Iowa. Between 1840 and 1850 is going to raise by over 150,000 people, or by about 345.8%. And then it really goes, and we tack on about another 1 million people over the course of the 1850s, moving from the eastern United States and Europe into this area. That's going to redefine life for people there. We can look at how this population density is climbing as it relates to how the government's calculating this frontier. We can see where people are coming from, and as those numbers continue to stack. But what I think is really important is this improved versus unimproved lands. This means these lands have been surveyed. If they're in the improved category, that means somebody's built something on them, most likely a farm. Farms are going to plow, they're going to fence, and they're going to introduce livestock. They're going to radically change the environment, and therefore change the way the Dakota are able to feed themselves in this environment. Carefully developed lifeways that came into being over hundreds, if not thousands of years to survive this difficult climate are going to radically change in a very short amount of time. So as we see this unimproved versus improved lands, we see a shift to active resistance. And this is an important piece. One of the things that we can see is two instances in Clear Lake, Iowa, which people, see they call this the lakes, where I live they call that the lake. And then someone just keep driving. You know. Clear Lake, in 1853, is finally starting to see some American settlement. And we see Inkpaduta consistently asserting Dakota presence and power, not only there, he's going to capture two men on the Shell Rock that come up from Cedar Falls that are exploring in the area. They eventually escape. We see him creating a range of different relationships with Americans, whether that's how he's talking to William Williams at Fort Dodge, whether it's incidents that are going to take place on the Boyer River, whether it's him showing up and pulling the surveying stakes that Ambrose Call is laying out near Algona. And in Clear Lake, something interesting happens in 1853. The Winnebago, or the Ho-Chunk, are being moved out of their ancestral land of Wisconsin under the Treaty of 1830. The government has already went through a moment of violent resistance during what people commonly call the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk War in Wisconsin, and those people are being moved after they've gone through this period of incredible violence. And some of them show up in Clear Lake at this fledgling settlement. There's only a few people there. There's this guy, Joseph Hewitt, who is running a trading post. He ran a mail route out to the Calls in Algona so they could get news of the world. But there's not many people there. And as the Winnebago Ho-Chunk arrive, the Dakota also come from the west. And they demand that the people in Clear Lake send the Winnebago back east. This is our land. And the people in Clear Lake do it. In the middle of the night, they load these Winnebago Ho-Chunk into wagons and send them back down Highway 9 to Fort Atkinson, where they can be protected. Over the next year, people keep coming. This is think about those numbers we just looked at. It's a time of incredible change. People are moving into these areas, and Clear Lake's growing a little bit. Still not huge, but by 1854, we definitely have more people there. And again, the Dakota show up and they start making demands of the population of Clear Lake. Now, I can't tell you for certain, based on the recorded records, because it turns out people in the 1850s kind of lumped all native peoples together, and it says a group of Sioux showed up in Clear Lake. I know there's like between 15 to 18 males with the group. I know it stacks up with other accounts of the Red Top Band or Inkpaduta's band during that time period, but it could also be Inkpaduta's band. But I do think it was Inkpaduta because it sounds like it, and maybe I'm just, whatever. I told you my knowledge isn't perfect, but I'm trying. Either way, the Dakotas show up, and they make some demands, particularly for like tribute type things. You need to feed us. You are on our land. You owe us something for being here, which is consistent with Dakota economy, Dakota political structure, how the Dakota lived in the time period before Europeans and Americans come into the area. But by 1854, the people in Clear Lake are not having it. They said, there's 15 to 18 of you. They send a call out, well, it's not a call, they send a rider who goes to the burgeoning metropolis of Norris Springs, which was the largest town in Sarasota County at the time, passes through Masonic Grove, which is now Mason City, on what was then called Lime Creek and is now the Winnebago River. And they just call out a local militia and they ride out, and I don't know much about Dakota math, but I believe that Inkpaduta probably just counted and looked at these people have more, better guns, and we never saw the Dakota again in Sarasota County. They moved west, stayed west. And that's where we can see this active resistance changing, where the Dakota are willing to confront this, but as population comes into the picture, it radically changes the outcomes. And they start to stay in this western part. We know a lot about Inkpaduta in 1856, 1857. We know he shows up in Mankato and tries to draw annuities at one point in time. We know he went on a buffalo hunt out into the Dakotas. We know he passes through Spirit Lake in the late fall and heads down to Smithland. I believe he was at Spirit Lake earlier in the summer because it's really consistent with Dakota corn agriculture. Sometimes we don't think about the Dakota farming. Gwen Westerman in her book, and I would encourage you to take a look at it, because if we listen to the Dakota themselves, they talk about Spirit Lake as the place where they first learned how to grow corn. Sounds like Iowa. And there's a sacred story associated with that I'm not going to get into because I'm a rapidly aging white guy. But go read it, take a look at it, but know that that significance is there for the Dakota people. They grew corn here. Also, some of the pots that were pulled out of Minnewacan State Park and some of those fragments over the past couple of summers by our state archaeologists tie in with the pottery that was used to store corn at Milox and at Inkpaduta and at other places the Dakota lived. And the Dakota would usually plant corn, leave, come back, harvest it, store some, and eat it. Now, one of the things you're probably looking at me going like, Dakota didn't grow corn, you're wrong. Samuel Pond was a missionary to the Dakota, and he spent a lot of time undercutting the Dakota grew corn. In fact, he writes in his book pretty early, and he was a missionary, and he also was one of the first people working on the translation of the Dakota language. And he writes, well, the Dakota grow some corn, and then they eat it in the green state, but they don't save any of it. And then 2 pages later, he goes into like this long, in-depth, 4-paragraph description of how the Dakotas dry and store corn. And you're like, I see what you did there. Some of these sources you got to read a little bit against the grain, and that's where a lot of this stuff, like, again, I don't think I have all the answers to this. I think it's stuff that, as I look into it more and more, I can tell you that I really care about just understanding these people better and understanding our shared past. I mean, as we move into this era and the Dakota are growing corn, I think Inkpaduta was here earlier in the summer. I think he spent a lot of time at Spirit Lake in the summer. We know Okoboji in the Dakota language means place of rest. And eventually he passes through down to Smithland, and this is where we see things really start to change. And things have been radically changing around him. And I want to take a moment again to think about our own kind of experiences. Anybody get real nostalgic? Anybody hate wind turbines? That's a question I shouldn't ask. I love this photo. I took this photo when I was walking across Iowa 2 summers ago, chasing dragoons up the Des Moines River for 371 miles. And I took this down near Emmitsburg, I think just north of town along the West Fork. But I think in the way that we see like these futures coming, and sometimes they make us very uncomfortable, and we have to think about our own nostalgia and how some of these things come into play, and how a lot of times change is incredibly difficult, especially big changes that we feel like we have no control over. And Inkpaduta is in this position of leadership, where leadership within the Wakakute, in this landscape that we're living in, passes from Wambisapa and Tisagi to the next generation, to Sito-Miniduta. And now we're not going to talk about the no-good horse thief Henry Lott. Well, I mean, we can later during the questions, I guess. But we see Sito-Miniduta eventually killed by Henry Lott, another incidence of Inkpaduta trying to adapt. He goes and tries to get justice at the sham trial at Homer, and I think that really changes how Inkpaduta thinks about American sovereignty and American justice and what it's like for Native peoples in this American dynamic. That's, again, I think we can get lost in the weeds there, and if you go down to Boone County, you can read the sign where Milton Lott died, and it'll tell you that that was the start of the Spirit Lake Massacre. And I'm like, well, I think it started to change how Inkpaduta thought about Americans as some of these events played out. When we see this altered world changing, I think we have a 4th frontier that develops here that's going to really make a final change to the sovereignty and autonomy. There's no longer an option for the Dakota to maintain a sovereign people. It's going to be subsumed to the United States. Whether they continue to passively and actively resist like Inkpaduta, or whether like other leaders like Little Crow in Minnesota that are other parts of the Santee Dakota, and they accept the American deal and move on to the Minnesota River Reservation. They're all making choices, trying to survive in this environment. But the choice is, you're going to accept Americanization as this final frontier crosses over, because it's going to completely rewrite the landscape that we live in. So let's take a look at a few other numbers. So this is an environmental frontier, the last to cross Iowa. Once we get population, those people are doing something. Roland Gardner came here and he was going to farm. He never quite got there here. He farmed in Clear Lake a little bit. But we have the numbers of farms, we have corn production, wheat production, oat production, all these things that we can look at. And we can see 1850, that's just shy of 15,000 farms in the state of Iowa. That number grows to over 61,000 a decade later. And each of those farms is introducing livestock, putting up fences, chopping down trees that were habitat for species that peoples like the Dakota and the Sauk and the Squawky and the Potawatomi and the Iowa-Vahoe all rely on to live in these ways that they've been living for years and years and years. And when I think about Inkpaduta, I think about he's the person in charge as this is happening. We see corn production climbing. You know, we're almost to 9 million bushels, which is nothing. But eventually we get to 52 million. We're climbing those rankings. We made it from 19th to 7th by 1860, but you know we're coming for the #1 spot. We see one of the other things that I think is interesting about this, why I included at the bottom, because like hops aren't that significant, especially reported hops, but it's nice that it drops off because that shows you that we're getting more and more access to external markets, because it's not that people quit drinking beer, I promise. They went and started to gain access to those things in other places. So we see some of these things rewriting this. We can also see this in terms of animals, because animals are an incredible indicator of environmental change. And one of the things we can see here, horses, a lot of times we think about breaking plows, but during this early era of settlement and early farming in Iowa, as pioneers are coming out to eagerly break these prairies, mules, working oxen are going to be the most important animals on farms. The more horses we see, though, means the more developed farms we have, and the people are riding team haul distance to town to pull wagons to at least sell some limited products. We can also see sheep are incredible at rewriting an environment around them through grazing vegetation. There's a really good book about it called The Plague of Sheep. It talks about Mexico. Then we see our first hogs. You know, we're not quite to the place we are today where we have so many more pigs than people, but we do have more pigs than people even then. And then we also can see that this is a value that's building in. The basis of our agricultural economy that still is the heartbeat of Iowa today is starting to grow during this time period. These people are coming and recognizing the benefits of living here. And they're rewriting the environment around them, and we can see how this impacts a specific animal. So Backford, Dickinson County, 1870, last buffalo. But we can see some of these other dates that have been tracked down in these counties, and why I have these county maps, or these are where I found Inkpaduta. At the time I had put these charts together for the Annals of Iowa. I found them in a couple of other places now. We can see the last time anybody recorded seeing a buffalo in northwestern Iowa, 1866, 1857 where I live, 1870 out here at the head of Little Sioux. But one of the things that should stand out to you is that this incredibly vital protein source is completely disappearing from the state. Elk are also declining, which are more important than bison to the Dakota living in Iowa, where we can see by the 1870s in particular, those populations have dwindled. We also see no elk reported in some of the counties. Any of you that are going to drive home later, you may not believe me. We also, during this time period, completely extirpated white-tailed deer from the state of Iowa. Moved the population to 0. Now if you got to drive somewhere in the dark, and you're my wife and you just attract them, you're mad that we ever, well, I don't know. The deer came back in Iowa through 3 locations, one being the state game farm in Boone, one being just south of Iowa City, one being out by Council Bluffs where a guy's fence fell down and he had a private herd of deer and they escaped. And turns out deer without a predator will reproduce like crazy. Over 100% population increase annually if we look at that. But by the winter of 1856-57, deer populations in Iowa are almost completely eliminated following that brutal winter. Because the winter of 1856-57, I'm sure you've heard about it, it's maybe the worst. At least, I don't know, we all talk about winters as being bad, but if you go back and look at some of the things that I looked at, like dendrochronology or like tree ring data, and see the precipitation amounts for those years, or you look at some of the early weather reports that are coming out of places like Council Bluffs or Fort Dodge or the eastern part of the state, or just read the accounts of people and see the wildlife populations decline. It was an all-timer. And as this happens, it's going to create pressure and stress on everyone, especially as this population's building. Because the more people that are living in this area, the more they're hunting and the more they're trying to survive. So you guys got to get involved in local history, whether you live here or somewhere else, I don't know. Whether it's just like paying your $25 and supporting these organizations or getting more involved with your time. Because I learned this lesson the hard way. I told you I went out and was going to all these different places all over northwestern Iowa looking for all these records. And then one rainy day I decided I should walk the 4 blocks to the Mason City Public Library because I hadn't been there yet. The sweetest lady. I went in there and I was like, here's what I'm working on. She said, oh. You know these types of ladies. I bet some of you are these types of ladies. Just been sitting in the Historical Society for 45 years, compiling records, typing them out, first on a typewriter, now maybe on a computer, but maybe not. And she's like, oh, I have something you're going to find very interesting. She pulls out a ledger from Joseph Hewitt, who's the first trader at Clear Lake, and in there, in the fall of 1856, late summer, there's an entry for one Roland Gardner, as he's dispatched his property in Forest City and is buying supplies to head west to strike out to the Iowa Great Lakes to, I mean, property here is still pretty valuable, and I think he saw that. This is where the bet comes in. Because he had moved to Clear Lake and he was a little bit late. Wasn't getting the best land there. I've been trying to figure out exactly on the plat map where he was at. I've got it narrowed down to like a couple of sections. But he wasn't on the lake. He had heard from other people that were passing through that this place was here, you know, and if we think back to the very beginning of when I started just yammering at you a while ago, he knew that there was potential in this place, and he decided to jump, be one of the first people here, get the best point. Pillsbury Point, I'm sure, like those houses are worth a lot. That's why it's Iowa's smallest state park. And Roland Gardner comes out and he makes a bet. And I think it was reasonable. If we think about our frontiers, right? If he looked at the treaties, he would say, well, the Dakota Sioux have signed these treaties. Most recently in 1851, that's supposed to completely move them out of the state. Even if he wasn't that interested in that, he looked at, well, they decommissioned Fort Dodge in 1853. That's a pretty strong signal that it's probably safe to move there. They'd taken Fort Dodge, they'd moved to Fort Ridgely in Minnesota, where they were trying to push the Dakota onto the Minnesota River Reservation. And Roland Gardner went, I'll be there. And he took his family, and he went, too late to plant a crop, he had his supplies, and then the worst winter in 150 years settled over the northern Great Plains. We're not on the Great Plains. John Locke would be so mad. If you're on the live stream, sorry. Midwest. Sorry, we've been fighting that battle with the Middle West Review, which is a great publication from the University of Nebraska Press if you want to check it out. We see this moving to a new point of resistance as we trace Inkpaduta through this time period. So we have him navigating these challenges, and he passes through Spirit Lake sometime around when Roland Gardner is going to arrive. I like to think that they didn't cross paths in that fall, but we'll never know. He arrives at Smithland and the situation's changed. He had spent the previous umpteen number of years, as long as Americans were there, living at Smithland on the Missouri and Little Sioux confluence. And he was down there and he'd been living and established a good relationship with the persons whose land he was staying on. That man sold his land during 1856 and moved to Sioux City. The new person who had bought the land, not friendly to the Dakota, told them they couldn't stay there, they needed to move, so they moved a couple of miles down the river. We see some of these other environmental factors playing in. People like Elijah Adams show up with huge groups of people, at least for frontier standards, and start settling here. And they've also had plans, like Roland Gardner, to ride out the winter with reasonable expectations. They brought a herd of cattle. They had grown some grain that they were planning to hay. And one of the most important events that happens at Smithland happens in the late fall. There's a prairie fire that wipes out their hay crop. The cattle start to die as the winter gets worse. That creates some conflicts, and if you're familiar with this story, there's all sorts of little accounts from Smithland that show this resistance moving from active resistance, peoples pushing against each other, the settlement community and the Dakota people. There's an incident where somebody, like, to paraphrase, kicks somebody's dog, or the Dakota shoot an elk and it gets chased off, or we see accusations being hurled that Dakota women are stealing corn from the settlers, or that they're taking cattle that have died and eating them. We see this escalation and escalation and escalation as the winter gets worse and worse. And by February, the people at Smithland form a militia and they confront the Dakota. Now, if we look at some of those records, and I've had, I know several of the people who are ancestrally descended from some of the folks at Smithland that have been really kind, including, like, if you're interested in reading more about this, you haven't checked out Cheryl Tevis's recent article in the Iowa History Journal. I mean, her direct ancestor was there at Smithland. She's a wonderful woman. And she's written about this very recently. You go to Hy-Vee and get it still, probably it's on the shelf. But as things escalate at Smithland, the militia comes together, they disarm the Dakota, and they push them out into the worst winter that we've had in 150 years. And they start moving up the Little Sioux. And if we go down to Peterson, we can see some conflict there, right? We see the Dakota exercising a range of responses that I would still classify as probably adaptative. We're going to see them break in. We're going to see them kill a cow. We're going to see some limited violence break out in different places. If you're from around here, you already have feelings about the Gillette's Grove story, and I'll let you keep them, and we can talk about it later or something. But all I know is the Dakota move up the Little Sioux River, which was the opposite of what the people of Smithland thought they would do. They thought they would go into Nebraska. They'd keep going west. And instead, they returned to their site of their summer village at Okoboji, place of rest. And one of the things that keeps me up at night about this, I mean, there's lots of things, but why does it change when they get here? What's the difference? Any summer people here yet for the season? That's why I scheduled it on this date. I wanted the real people. So imagine you leave this talk later tonight, which is going way longer than I intended it to. You go home and somebody's moved into your house. They're eating out of your fridge. You're desperate. I don't know how desperate you are, but if you didn't eat dinner before this, you're like, when will this guy quit talking? And I want you to think about how you'd respond. Because one of the things that I think about, and we could look at Abby's account, I think there's validity in that. Those are her memories of those events. We can listen to the Dakota stories about it. We can think about as this violence erupted and rippled across the lakes. And one of the things that sticks in my mind is, I think about it as Inkpaduta running. They've been disarmed, pushed out into the worst winter. On his way up the Little Sioux, one of his grandchildren starves to death. And I don't have kids. You even mess with my niece, though, I'll mess you up. And when we think about these dire straits that Dakota arrive here in, I think it brings a new complexity to this story, and that they're pushed to a point of violent resistance that isn't different than what we see playing out across the continent all the way back to 1622 in Jamestown. We can see this play out with the Powhatan Confederacy and culminating in the Virginia Massacre of 1622. These same responses where you see passive resistance, active resistance, violent resistance. We could see it with Metacom in the Northeast. We could see it with various peoples throughout the Great Lakes region. We could see it with the Sauk in 1832 as Black Hawk leads his people back and violently resists. We can see it with Inkpaduta even later after the story ends. Because the story doesn't end in March of 1857. We know it doesn't end for Abby until summer. Well, it never ended for Abby. And how could it? I mean, and I think about that sometimes too. Inkpaduta left, right? And we know this story because if you bought your copy, you can get to the end and you can read until Abby gets ransomed and she comes back and she spends like, do you guys just ever think about how radically different Abby Gardner was for the 1800s? I'm trying not to use some kind of profanity to make my grandmother mad on the live stream. She was a tough lady who bucked a lot of trends. I mean, she built that museum. She fought the government to build a monument, and she wrote a book that was widely circulated, and some of you already bought today, over 100 years later. Pretty impressive lady. She dedicated herself to preserving this memory. And also, if you go through the Iowa newspaper database, you just search Abby, she's the most fascinating person. Don't lose sight of her story as ending in captivity. She was an incredible redemptive story. Inkpaduta's story is one of continued resistance. Inkpaduta heads west. We know the ransom story. And he stays west. One of the things that's really interesting is Inkpaduta, there's a story that talks about how he got in a huge fight with his sons in the aftermath of the attack on Spirit Lake. And he talked about, we can't go back there. It's over for us there. Our only hope is to stay west, beyond these frontiers, and continue to live life the best we can, and live with the Yanktonmi, and live with Dakota. Inkpaduta is the Battle of Little Bighorn with Sitting Bull, and then they flee after that last great indigenous victory on the North American continent across the border into Canada, where Inkpaduta dies, outside the reach of American justice. His story continues to be one of resistance. continues to be one trying to lead his peoples in traditional life ways that were consistent with the generations before him. In the same way, I hope we all honor the people that came before us in our own ancestry. And as we move through this violent resistance, we can see this. I'm going to skip this. This is a video. You can see it online. But as we take a look at this, I want you to understand that, like, we go through this story, and hopefully as we've talked through some of this, and we've tried to understand Inkpaduta a little bit better, and understand how this resistance built over time, we can move away from these oversimplified stories of this event. There's incredible complexity here, and there's tragedy on all sides. What happened to Abby Gardner-Sharp is unbelievable. The suffering Inkpaduta watched his people go through and personally experienced leading the Wapakute Dakota in Iowa over the course of his lifetime is also incredibly tragic. It's the loss of lifeways that developed over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it came to a head right here. I appreciate you guys coming out tonight, and I will try to answer some of your questions. But we're in a big room, and it's 8:21. A couple of other quick things before we get into questions. I do lots of other weird stuff, and if you want a sticker later, or you're trying to get a hold of me because you got like cool stuff, like a guy hand drew me a map earlier today of like a place I gotta go see tomorrow. You can get a sticker. I don't know if you have a laptop or a, I don't know, put it on the back of a stop sign for all I care. But for notes on Iowa, which is a project I started with my walk across Iowa a couple of years ago to start having conversations about history with more people, because I'm really tired of talking to other nerds that don't want to engage with people. I'm really good at writing boring stuff nobody wants to read. I wanted to improve at sharing history with people in other ways. So when I walked across the state, I bought a drone and I learned how to edit video, and I started to put together some different stuff. And you can find that there, whether it's about the walk across the state. You could also find I do this thing called Iowa History Daily that does over 1 million views a month across platforms on the website, which every single day I just write 4 paragraphs about something that happened in Iowa history. Like today, pre-flight naval training school at the University of Iowa ended. If you guys like the Iowa Hawkeyes, you'll really like the Iowa Seahawks, who beat Notre Dame in football during World War II. But I do that every day. I also am working on a different project about public lands where I have, for the last 51 weeks, I've put out 5-minute short videos incorporating newspaper articles, other historical documents, drone footage, and other stuff I filmed at 62 of Iowa state parks last summer as I explore how we're 49th out of 50 states in state and federally held public lands. I wanted to understand that story better, so I figured I'd get out and do it. I also just really like having these conversations with people. I want to understand this better. My knowledge is imperfect about this. And one of the things that I've really learned through, whether it's being at my local historical society, whether it's going out and visiting people at places like the Dickinson County Museum, or having opportunities to work with you all last summer at the State Historical Society at the cabin, people really care about not only this story, but they care about the past of this place. Turn that into action, because our history is incredible, and together we can keep preserving it for future generations. I don't know, I'm trying to see. Anybody want to go out? Anybody got a classic academic conference? More of a comment, but a question? I'm ready. Or we can talk about it. Front row.
A couple facts I came across in doing some research.
Sure.
In the summer of 1857, they literally still found snow in Minnesota.
We can't hear the question. Could you stand up?
I'll reiterate.
Okay, thank you.
So they found snow in Minnesota on the 4th of July in 1857. Wild. I mean, if we put that in, the accounts as you go through the different records are just completely astounding. And some of them I kind of put with a grain of salt because, we all walk to school uphill in the worst winter blizzards. But snow on the 4th of July. I can tell you when I was at college in North Dakota, it snowed in June and September, and I went I'm leaving as soon as possible. You got another one for us?
One of them I uncovered in the Spirit Lake Library, Shata, I'm not sure.
Sure.
son of Dakota. He and his sister were taken in by a family after the rest of Dakota's family's killed. And Inkpaduta stopped and picked them up on his way up here. And the young Massacre could speak English. She turned around and told the woman, "You need to leave. We are going to kill white people." So I never heard of that. It was premeditated, but that made me curious.
Sure, and like I don't know how much like.
We couldn't hear any of that.
Okay, so there's a story about Inkpaduta who's going to be killed by Henry Lot, and then we see happen after that his children. Inkpaduta is going to become the head of that band. He's going to be taken in by a family, he's going to be trained, and he learns how to speak English in Mankato. Eventually we're going to see him ranging through these traditional areas. He shows up in Algota, he shows up in Sarasota County, he shows up before and after the events in March of 1857. And there is a story that you can find in some of these different sources where he allegedly told somebody that they were going to, that this woman should leave because they were going to kill the white settlers. I don't have the answer. I've run across that too. I think when people talk about this as premeditated or tie it to other events, I look at it more as this process and the way we're talking about it, in the same way we all get pushed to breaking points. And that's really how I think about it. And whether that's right or wrong, over the last 7 years, I can tell you I've just been obsessed with this. And I know some of you have been obsessed with this for way longer. And if you read all the different stuff, you run into these different conflicting theories. We run into different stuff that we talk about. And what I encourage you is keep looking for more sources. Know that that's a part of the story. And that's where there is all sorts of stuff out there on this. Including, you could read, I wrote 300 pages about this. It's available free through the Iowa State Library. It's called Forces of Nature, and it's my doctoral dissertation. It's not an easy read, but I did cut out the 18 pages about fish species in Iowa at the Dakota Fish Fair. So cut out some of the stuff. I also wrote an article that was published last year that's also available free online that you can get through. I know it's on the Notes Facebook page, and I think and some of the other links for tonight's event. That's called Inkpaduta in Iowa, Dakota Decline, Dispossession and Erasure, and talks about them. And that's more for a general audience. It's 25 pages, but it has a lot of the data there too, so that might be something to take a look at. And then also go visit your different groups. Look at these different sources. Talk to people about this story that people really care about. Any other quick ones? Yes, sir?
Yeah, when you were touring those counties to find the range of Inkpaduta, where did you actually find most of your references, or did you have to buy a lot of library cards?
So I looked for those people that I was talking about. Usually they're little old ladies. No. With this story, it's a variety of different people. But every community kind of has their person, especially that's really into this. Like Lake Park, somebody earlier today was like, hey, there's a guy on the other side of town who's got 45,000 arrowheads you should go see. A lot of times I looked for those people. And then I would ask, in the same way that anytime you're trying to meet more people, well, who else should I talk to about this? Because like one of the things is like, it'd be really easy to get caught up into like I know I keep reiterating, I don't have all the answers. But history will keep you really humbled in that I know I don't know it all, and I know that there are people out there that have pieces of this story because I hear them every once in a while. I've never come out here to give a talk. I've never given this talk anywhere. I've never posted anything about this and not learned something new about it where somebody goes, well, have you heard this? Or have you seen this map? Or have you put this together? And I think that's one of the things that, so I looked for that. I looked at, I'm a big newspaper database person. So I was looking in both the Minnesota and Iowa newspaper databases, trying to find references to the event, and a lot of the times we see those relayed later. And then archival sources, whether that's at the State Historical Society's research libraries in Iowa City and Des Moines, or at places like the Minnesota Historical Society has a ton of records related to the Dakota in particular, and then also to pieces of story, or things like the Algona Historical Society has Ambrose Call's journals, or the Mason City Archive with the Joseph Hewitt stuff, or meeting people like Cheryl Tevis, you go, oh, well, you know, Elijah Adams is my great-great-granddaddy, and I've got all his letters right here. You want to look at them? And I think that's part of it is, like, we want history to be really easy, and clean. And it's just incredibly complex. And there's all sorts of different ways to look through this prism and see the past. And one of the things with this, I'm trying to just see as many of those angles as I can and share it with other people. So I'll stick around if you guys got other stuff we want to talk about, or come get a sticker and send me an email, or send me a letter. I don't know if you don't use the internet. Give me a call at my office at Waldorf. I love talking about this. I'm sure my wife is on the live stream going, you were supposed to be done talking 30 minutes ago. But I appreciate you guys coming out. Thank you for supporting local history. Thank you for supporting the school.
Thank you, Kevin. This was just totally amazing. There are no other words for it. We appreciate all that you've done.